Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. We have not treated a story from the New Testament for a while. This week we will deal with one of the most famous stories, which is unique to the Gospel of John. We will do this in two parts. The story I have in mind is found in John 11, and it's about the raising of Lazarus. The narrative begins with a matter-of-fact statement that a certain man was ill, namely Lazarus of Bethany. This man lived in Bethany and had two sisters, Mary and Martha. That's in verse 1. Then we are informed that it was Mary who had anointed Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. What is interesting about our being informed of this is that this did not happen until the very next chapter, John chapter 12, verse 3. In any case, the narrator used that incident to identify Lazarus' sister. Curiously, the first time Mary and Martha are mentioned in this gospel occurs for the first time in John 11. After this brief introduction, the sisters, obviously Mary and Martha, sent word to Jesus that, quote, "He whom you love is ill," end of quote. This is the first time we are made aware of this relationship that Jesus had with Lazarus and, by extension, with Mary and Martha. When Jesus received this message, he dismissed its gravity by saying, presumably to his disciples, though that is not specified, that Lazarus' illness was hardly terminal. Instead, he elaborated that the illness came about for the glory of God. Indeed, the illness would serve to glorify the Son of God. That's in verse 4. At this point, the narrator underscored the fact that Jesus loved Martha and her sister, and of course Lazarus. That's in verse 5. Yet, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he still stayed 2 days longer at the place where he had been staying. That's in verse 6. After this delay, Jesus told the disciples that it was now time to return to Judea. That's in verse 7. But this made no sense to the disciples, who reminded Jesus that the Jews just recently had tried to stone him. That's in verse 8. The event to which Jesus referred to was narrated in the previous chapter 10, verses 31 through 39. In response to the disciples' reluctance to return to Judea and risk being stoned or arrested, Jesus expatiated about the time frame involved in this unfolding drama. He asked, rhetorically, whether there were 12 hours of daylight on any given day. Then he elaborated by noting that when one goes somewhere in daytime, there is no fear of stumbling when one sees the quote-unquote light of this world. That's verse 9. Instead, one stumbles when one walks at night, which means not only that it is dark, but that, quote, the light is not in him, that is, the stumbling person. That's in verse 10. Almost certainly, Jesus is pointing out that he just happens to be the light that prevents falling. Of course, we were told at the beginning of this gospel that Jesus was the light that enlightens everyone. That's in chapter 1, verses 4 and verses 7 through 9. Either the narrator or Jesus himself identifies himself as the light in John, and that's in chapter 3 of the Gospel of John, verses 19 through 21. In this little discussion, Jesus made it clear that Lazarus' illness needed to be seen in a much larger context than the individual illness of a single person. Right after this peroration about light, Jesus tells the disciples that Lazarus has, quote, fallen asleep, and that he needed to go to awaken him. That's in verse 11. The disciples are completely befuddled by this remark. They reasoned that if Lazarus had merely fallen asleep, there was no need to go to see him. People who are asleep will wake up without any assistance. That's in verse 12. At this juncture, the narrator lets us know that Jesus was using sleep as a metaphor for death. That's in verse 13. Jesus confirms this when he tells the disciples plainly that Lazarus is dead. He goes on to say that he was glad he was not there when Lazarus expired because he wanted the disciples to believe. What Jesus wanted the disciples to believe was not yet clear. Nevertheless, Jesus said that it was now time for them to go see Lazarus. That's in verse 15. Thomas spoke up when he heard Jesus say this. He figured that going back would be enormously risky, but he encouraged the rest of the disciples to go ahead and take this trip so that, quote, we may die with him, end of quote. Obviously, Thomas thought that this episode would not end well. That's in verse 16. By the time Jesus got to Bethany, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. He was already interred in a tomb. That's in verse 17. Because Bethany was only a couple of miles from Jerusalem, many Jews had come to pay their respects and offer condolences to Martha and Mary. That's in verses 18 and 19. With Jews already at the site of the tomb, it is impossible not to think of the warning they had issued to Jesus, not to mention Thomas's concern that they were going into a hornet's nest. In the meantime, Martha left to greet Jesus, while Mary remained at the house. That's in verse 20. Straight away, Martha scolded Jesus when she met him, and she scolded him because of the delay. She thought that if Jesus had been there when her brother was ill, he might have survived. That's in verse 21. Even so, she surmised that Jesus had the power to pray to God, who would give Jesus whatever he asked. That's in verse 22. Excuse me. When she said this, Jesus told the grieving sister that, quote, your brother will rise again, end of quote. Being a good Jew, many of whom believed in a general resurrection at the last day, Martha affirmed readily her belief in that doctrine. Rather than responding to Martha's affirmation of faith in a general resurrection, Jesus said, quote, I am the resurrection and the life, end of quote. Then he goes on to explain this astounding statement. Anyone who believes in him, in spite of experiencing death, will nevertheless live. As well, any who lives and believes in me, that is Jesus, shall never die. At first, this seems quite contradictory. In the first instance, Jesus suggests that death will not prevent living. In the second instance, Jesus suggests that living and believing in him will prevent death altogether. Obviously, there are layers of life and death in terms of meaning in Jesus' remarks. On the one hand, death is not the end of life. In another way, or in another dimension, life goes on. On the other hand, believing and living in Jesus gives a completely new meaning of death. At least, if Jesus is right, death need no longer be feared. In any case, once Jesus makes these somewhat enigmatic remarks, he asks Martha directly, Do you believe this? That's in verse 26. She does not respond with a simple yes. She elaborates by including what she believes about Jesus, namely that he is the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. She prefaces her statement by calling Jesus Lord. When Martha says this, she is articulating a full-orbed confession of faith regarding Jesus, his identity as the Jewish Messiah, the very Son of God, who is coming into the world. In a sense, Martha is confirming every confession about Jesus' exalted status that is present in the previous chapters in this gospel. What Martha says about Jesus at this juncture makes the whole scene a pivotal one. Jesus had already done a number of signs in this gospel. Now we have to prepare ourselves for a much more strategic sign. Right after this face-to-face interaction between Martha and Jesus, somehow the disciples are backgrounded at this point, she went to tell Mary, her sister, that, quote, the teacher is here and he's coming for you, end of quote. That's in verse 28. Referring to Jesus as the teacher right then underscores the affirmations about his being the resurrection and the life. This is extremely important teaching. When Mary heard from her sister, she got up quickly and went to see him. At this time, Jesus had not yet entered the village. Instead, he was still where he was when he had been conversing with Martha. As Mary rushed to go to Jesus, many of the Jews who were in the house to console the sisters followed her. They figured that she was headed to the tomb to weep. That's in verse 31. When Mary arrived at where Jesus still was, she fell at his feet and did what her sister had done previously, namely criticize Jesus for not being there while Lazarus was still alive. She said poignantly, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." End of quote. That's in verse 32. This time Jesus did not engage in theological discourse. When he saw Mary crying and the many Jewish friends also crying, he was overcome with emotion. More specifically, he was, quote, deeply moved in spirit and troubled, end of quote. That's in verse 33. Whether this intimates something more than ordinary human emotional reactions to the death of a friend and empathy for the mourners, it is hard to say. If there is more to the description of Jesus' emotions, it may be in the realm of his reaction to his own pending death. I will come back to this supposition. Regardless, Jesus at this point asked where the tomb was. That's in verse 34. Jesus was told to, quote unquote, come and see. Just then, Jesus himself wept. That's in verse 35. Some of the Jewish friends saw this and remarked how much Jesus must have loved Lazarus. Others, though, wondered why a man who had just opened the eyes of a man blind since birth, a story related in John chapter 9, could not have prevented Lazarus from dying in the first place. With this sentiment, the Jews have the same questions about Jesus that Martha and Mary had also posed. There is much more to this story, which we will conclude in next week's podcast. For now, let me encourage you to go to my newly developed website, faspina.com. Check it out, and also let me know what your email is so that I can contact you. And if you have questions you would like me to answer in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.